Hey everyone, I wanted to welcome you to the Agile at Scale SIG for January. And yeah, we've got a great topic coming up. But first, just want to tell everyone a little bit about the organization. Agile Austin has been kicking around Austin for almost 20 years now, coming up on that anniversary. But we are a 501c6 profit organization. So we just love to educate folks, connect, collaborate, and grow in all of all our knowledge of all things Agile. Our board for this year, we have Max, who is our president. He joins a lot of these SIGs. Don't see him here yet today, but he's, of course, our fearless leader. Sid, thanks for joining today. She's our vice president, chief operating officer. Chase, myself, and Jenny are also on the board as well. So, been great to collaborate and work with all of those individuals this year. Did want to say a thank you to our sponsors. We have Agile Velocity, longtime supporter of Agile Austin, and a newer sponsor, Resumex. We've seen some social media postings about recently, and also another longtime sponsor, Ad Meliora Coaching at our silver level. And so Agile Velocity, of course, has discounts on their workshop. If you use the code Agile Austin, they'll get you 15% off their workshops. So check them out. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor, that's part of what makes programs like today free. So feel free to um, become a sponsor by emailing contact@agileaustin.org, and we can get the conversation going. The other thing that sustains the organization is the membership. So it's $35 a year. Again, that makes programs like today free, but it also you also have a Slack community that where we have various channels that are available. The AI one especially has had, a lot of interesting posts in recent times. So you can also vote and also become a board member, and then also additional special events and training discounts are available. So in terms of SIGs, this one's the Agile at Scale SIG, of course, but we have other events that happen, our coaching SIG, book club, product and AI leaders, Lean Kanban, fairly robust community outside of this one that meets up on a regular basis. So, and of course, we've got our big conference. It's a hybrid one, so we'll have virtual option as well as in person over at the conference center on the Pickle Research Center. Pickle Research Center up near the Domain in Austin. So if you're interested in that, just you can go to agileaustin.org. That direct link will take you right to the conference site itself. But yeah, just check that out for more details on the conference. We've signed up some sponsors for it. I'm very happy to have StarPath Consulting as our title sponsor. And again, kind of a repeat, ResumeX is platinum sponsor, and then gold sponsors, Carpe Diem Technologies, Evolve Agility, and then 10, 11, 12 is our Evolving with Agility a sponsor. And again, they help make these, the tickets for the conference especially, much more affordable than a lot of conferences you'll see. So we've just come to some conclusions on some of the speakers and topics that we'll have. So that'll be announced very soon, and we're really looking forward to seeing that happens. It'll be happening in April this year. So, anyways, again, let's get back to this SIG. Leland, who is my co-host, don't see him here yet, I don't think, but he has been hosting for many years, and I joined him in 2020, and yeah, we've been going strong. He's been getting a lot of good speakers over the last few years, including the one that we have for today. Upcoming, we do have actually some open slots, so if you're interested in speaking, March and April are free, but in February we'll have Michael McCullough talking about flow metrics and why they are not enough. And so for today, we've got Dan Walsh, and so very happy to have him here talking about mapping the lived experiences of your teams. And so, yeah, he's got some great stuff he'll be chatting with us about today and some exercises and such. So, with all of that, I'm going to stop my sharing and I am going to pass things over to Dan to take us away.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Let me figure out the sharing here. There is a link to this mural in the chat. If everyone could open up that, that would be great. Be great if we had some participation here today and make it more interactive. So, like Ben said, my name is Dan Walsh. I'm an Agile and product coach based in Austin, Texas. I grew up at Intel Corporation. I was there for about 18 years before starting my own consulting business. And at the time, our Agile community of practice was about 25,000 people or so, plus or minus. Some of the largest solution trains had 17 trains on them. So each train had 8 teams. So that's kind of a ridiculous scale in terms of a safe scale. And for this community of practice of 20,000, 25,000 practitioners, one of my favorite methodologies for kind of staying in touch with that community was this approach we're about here ready to talk about today. I'm going to hijack your screens for a moment while we walk through this, and then we'll have a quick exercise and I'll let you go. All right. So this talk is really a condensed version of a 3-hour session that we delivered at Agile 2024 with my partner, Betsy Azari. And it's really about tapping into kind of the lived experiences of employees across the organization and making sense of those experiences and essentially deciding what to do next. So by the end of our time here today, I'm hoping that you'll have a light introduction to narrative inquiry and this methodology called sense making, and help you see and understand how this approach can be leveraged within your own organizations as part of as a retrospective or organizational pulse. And I do think it is a fairly novel way of measuring culture change and transformation progress over time. So this story sharing session that we delivered at Agile 2024 really opens up with just working in small groups and sharing stories, sharing experiences in these small groups. And the opening prompt was share a recent experience that gives you hope or concern for the future of Agile. Now, obviously, these prompts can be changed and modified based on the type of research you're doing. But for the purpose of this exercise, I think it was a fairly generic open-ended prompt. It wasn't positive, it wasn't negative, it was fairly well balanced. And then once we had these participants share some experiences, we asked them to essentially write up those experiences on a form. And this is kind of what the form looked like at the time of the conference. Write your responses below with enough detail to make it easier for others to understand. Was it a story about hope or was it a story about concern? If the stories were on the news, what would the headline be? And then depending on the nature of the story, we asked, several questions. What was the overall sentiment of the experience you shared? Was it highly positive, highly negative? To what degree will the events in your story persist and recur again or happen over time? It's likely to persist or it's temporary, transitory. Were you able to, shape the situation that you shared? Was it impossible to change it, or do you think you had some agency to change it? Are you motivated to help shape the situation that you shared? Are you highly motivated or not motivated at all? And then what was your story mostly about? Was it about value delivery or planning or workload or psychological safety, teamwork, etc.? And then what was your role? So we're collecting some high-level demographic data as well. So to get a sense of what this is like, what we have here below, and this is going to be our first little kind of mini exercise, just throwing you guys into the deep end. We have a couple of the stories that people shared from the session, so we could read the stories here on the left. And then the exercise is to essentially, after you read the experience that people shared, These are two experiences. Essentially pick an icon and guess how you think they answered the 6 questions. So for example, if you want to be the piece of pizza, click on this icon for pizza and say, okay, I just read this story about working with an agile team and going through an agile reset to Scrum. And the title of the meeting is Death by Meetings. And I think they answered here, right? And so you're essentially positioning your icon where you think people, answered these questions. Any questions about this exercise? I'm gonna let you guys go. And let me know if you're having problems with Mural. I'd be happy to answer questions and help you out if you're new to Mural. But really what I'm asking is just pick an icon and make a guess on how they answered this set of questions for each of these two experiences. And while you do that, I'll let you multitask here a little bit. I will just read the experiences for the sake of the video recording. So this first experience here, the title is Death by Meetings. I'm working with a team going through an agile reset to Scrum. They added in some Scrum events and improved the usefulness of the events, but they won't cancel old meeting cadences that could be replaced by Scrum events. So they're now buried in meetings and hating life. And the second experience, just for the sake of this mini exercise here today, is called Proxies and Projects. This isn't working. The foundation for true agility includes being close to the customers and empowered autonomous teams. Unfortunately, the project-driven approach to planning from the top down and overuse of proxy roles has left the teams with work pushing down to them and no time or ability to get close to the customers. This means value or solutions are inferior and teams are uninspired to innovate. How do you think they answered this question? So answer both of these. Is anyone having problems with Mural? Any questions? All right, looks like you guys are doing fine. Yeah, go ahead and guess on the demographics too. That would be interesting to see what you guess. I'll give you another 30 seconds and we'll wrap it up. We have more stuff to cover. And this is just a very lightweight training exercise to get you used to this methodology. All right. We're going to call time here. Feel free to keep guessing if you'd like. I'm going to essentially reveal the quote unquote answers as answered by the participant submitting this response. So the red X's are how the person that lived this experience and shared this story answered these questions. All right, so we will circle back to this and what this means here in a bit. So just bear with me as we go through a lightweight introduction to sense making. And I'm going to, if you guys want to follow me, just click on my icon, or just follow along as I go through some of these slides. So this methodology is generally referred to as narrative inquiry. It's a qualitative research methodology where you're tapping into the anecdotes and the experiences of employees and trying to make sense of them. It's a bit like empathy interviews or behavioral interviews if you've done something like that before. And I think what you just experienced is what I refer to as sense making. Pretty much everything that I learned about this methodology is from David Snowden and the Kinevin Company and his partners in the Kinevin Company. And sense making is really all about how do you make sense of the world in order to take effective action. And this sense making methodology is really making sense of the stories and the lived experiences that people are sharing. So this is a high-level overview of this very scalable process, an ethnographic approach. Sometimes we refer to this as participative ethnography at scale. So it really starts off with these collecting stories about people's lived experiences. I hope you can just maybe envision or try and pretend that you understand what that would be. But basically, you get a bunch of people in a room. You present a prompt to elicit experiences, and then you get people to write up their experiences and answer several questions about it, like we did in that last form. This could be done in many different ways. You could do this as part of a retrospective. You could do kind of a mass marketing email and just ask people to submit experiences. We had storytelling champions where participants would submit a story once a day for their organization for the period of 2 weeks, and then they would pass the baton to another person. So there's lots of different ways you can collect stories. And once you collect the stories, you can analyze the patterns that were produced by answering the questions. So those questions are the quantitative metric that you could do all of your statistics on, your correlation analysis, t-tests, and things like that, and start to make sense of the patterns at scale. And once you start to make sense of those patterns, of course, you want to improve things. So you launch a series of interventions at different levels in the organization, at different parts of the organization to try and make things better. How do we get more positive stories and experiences like these? How do we dampen and perhaps even prevent or mitigate negative stories like those? And as you deploy your interventions, you continue to collect stories. And over time, if those interventions were successful, you'll start to see that reflected in the nature of the stories people are sharing. And that closes the loop on this process. So we're going to walk through this a little bit more. The process that you just experienced in that little mini exercise is called self-signification. It's where you essentially answer questions and you are tagging your qualitative narrative with quantitative data. And so hopefully you now understand that when you're answering these questions, you're essentially adding layers of meaning to this plain text above and beyond what's actually written. And one of the major advantages of this, obviously, is when you get some plain text like this, you don't have to guess how people felt. They will tell you how they felt about this experience. So it removes a high degree of researcher bias and reinterpretation because you allow the person that submitted the story or submitted the experience to actually tell you how they felt about it or what they think about that experience, right? You essentially have the ground truth from that person's perspective. So that is the really the key twist, I think, that differentiates this ethnographic approach from other methodologies. You're allowing participants to self-signify how they felt about their experience. Any questions on that? All right, so once you collect a bunch of stories, then you can start to analyze patterns. And the way you do this is you essentially start to convert these questions based on these sliders into 2x2 matrices. So the first set of questions, what's your overall sentiment on the experience and to what degree will this persist or happen again? We turn that into a 2x2 chart, right? Which is really kind of like maybe a mood chart. Like, how do you feel? Is this mood going to persist or not? And then the second 2x2, were you able to shape the situation that you shared? Are you motivated to change the situation? So this is really a a 2x2 matrix about intrinsic motivation and agency. And then, of course, we have some of the canonical, I would say, impediments to lean and agile transformations around, workload or efficiency, teamwork, psychological safety, transparency, etc. And we have you could color these stories based on the role as well. So in this case, we chose to color the stories based on if the person was a scrum master, an internal coach, an RTE, or were they a product person, or were they architecture, dev, QA, or were they a leader, program manager, or trainer, coach, etc. And so I think in the session we wound up with somewhere around 40 or 50 stories. And this is what the visualization looked like from the session. Obviously, if we collected stories in your own organization, it would look altogether different. But I want you to just maybe internalize for a moment that each one of these dots represents a story, and it's color coded based on the role. And even with this limited sample, you could start to see some patterns, I hope. There tends to be more negative stories here for the red dots, which in this case was the Scrum Masters, RTE, internal coaches, etc. And those negative stories tend to persist over time. This is what the stories were about. And then we essentially had a wall of these stories written up and tagged on the wall. So, for example, if you want to understand what the stories were about from leadership and management, so in this case, we had story number 23, 18, 53, 26, etc. So if you want to go and read just the stories about leadership and management, you would use these numbers to essentially go and read those specific stories. And then we also had a kind of a poster of headlines. So these are the high level kind of newspaper headlines that were about hope or stories that were about concern. So, people were welcome to kind of read through these at a high level. And if the headline was interesting, you could go and read that story. So you could see the one we read here, proxies and projects isn't working here on the lower right-hand side. So one of the reasons that we do this is it's really important to analyze the patterns before reading the individual stories. Even in this small exercise that was, took us about 3 hours, we produced, 40 to 50 stories. And it does take some time to read through the stories, and you don't have to read through them all. Really, I think the benefit is that you could choose what patterns you're interested in and then just read those stories. So for example, one team was interested in amplifying positive stories that are likely to persist and happen again. So you could just read the positive stories in this case, and maybe it's just the positive stories from leaders and program managers, project managers, which are in blue, or just the positive stories from Scrum Masters and RTEs. So depending on the pattern that you're interested in, you're able to kind of dig into the details on what was the experience that produced that pattern. And by digging into those details, then you start to have more context about what the nature of that experience that's shaping those patterns. And then we did a quick kind of exercise on making sense of the patterns with this methodology called adaptive action from Glenda Oyang. And it's really very simple, but it's all about kind of making sense of what happened. What does this pattern mean? What do we want to do about it? So what, now what? So it's a very lightweight way of starting to think about action and taking action. And that takes us to the next step, which is collective improvement and progress. But before we go there, any questions so far? I do want you guys to come off mute or ask questions in the chat. I'd be happy to take questions. Are you guys tracking with what I'm saying, or am I leaving some people behind?
Definitely tracking, and I'm kind of intrigued by the differences between our guesses and the reality of the answers that were given. Is that kind of usually what you see when you do an exercise like this?
Yeah, whew. Typically you don't, I don't know. I think there are cases where you might want to present a story and then have people guess and interpret what that person meant. The reason I use this as a training exercise is to get you to understand the purpose and the impactfulness of self-signification. You don't have to read the tea leaves of this plain text and guess what people felt or what they meant. Just ask them. Just ask them. You don't have to throw their stories into LLM and come up with some sentiment analysis. They will tell you how they felt. So it removes a tremendous amount of bias and error in your research when you have more of a ground truth answer from that person's perspective. That's the punchline of that exercise.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions? All right. So then you get into things like collective improvement with what, so what, now what. And there's lots of different methods and techniques around developing interventions for complex adaptive systems and safe to fail probes that we won't go into today. I'm happy to take questions on it if you'd like. But I think one of my favorite things, and this is absolutely in tune with Agile at scale and the nature of the SIG, is that when you do collect stories, you can have an organizational or even a company-wide pattern. And that large organizational company-wide pattern was created by individual teams. And this kind of mocked up example, you could say these are the stories from team A, these are the stories for team B, these are the stories from team C. And if you add them all together, you get this company-wide pattern. So depending on what your level of influence that you're at, if you're a Scrum Master, if you're an RTE, if you're a portfolio manager, if you're an executive, you could look at the patterns at a high level, read the stories that you have more control and influence over, and there's something that you could do at whatever level of the organization that you're at to get more stories like these and fewer like those, right? Because the stories coming from Team B or producing this pattern, so there's something that the Scrum Master of Team B can do, or the RTE of Team B can do about that pattern. So this enables, action at and parallel action at every level of the organization. And you can also perhaps slice this data set based on role, right? So rather than team A, team B, team C, you could say, give me all the stories from the Scrum Masters and the RTEs and let that community deal with those stories. Give me all the stories from product and let product management deal with those stories. So this is one of, I guess one of the more, I don't know, significant ways that you can enable cohesive action across different parts of the organization to all try and move the needle on one of these patterns. All right. And the other thing it gives you is a measure of progress. I think a lot of people have talked about how do you measure culture change over time? How do we know if we're making progress? How do we know if we're actually changing kind of the mindset and the way things are around here? And then these stories and how people signify them could be used as a measure of progress. So for example, if your company-wide pattern, you have 40% positive stories and 60% negative stories. So if you just, count up the dots, right? Let's say you have 50 dots in this case, right? So out of the 50 dots, maybe 30 of them are negative and 20 of them are positive. How do you change that ratio by deploying these interventions? And when you collect more data the next month, the next quarter, how do you go from a split of 40% positive, 60% negative to 60% positive and 40% negative, right? How do you get more positive stories like these and fewer negative stories like those? And that is a fantastic measure of progress for something as complex as an organization. The only way to move the needle and to, I don't know, make progress on this metric is to change the nature of the lived experiences that people are sharing in their stories. That is very, very difficult to game. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to change the nature of people's lived experiences. It's not like just answering I'm a 3.5 today and a quarter from now I'm a 4.0. Like that's very easy to game. Right here there are no right and wrong answers, right, to the nature of the stories that you're sharing. You're sharing your lived experience, you're sharing your own truth. Who are you to answer the questions, and how someone answered the questions for their own experience. So yeah, I think this is one of the reasons I'm such a big advocate and fan of this methodology. It gives you a measure of progress, for making meaningful progress in the nature of people's lives. So this essentially closes the loop, right? You can measure progress over time. You collect more stories. Those stories produce different kinds of patterns. Hopefully you're making progress. If you're not making the right progress, you're doing interventions at every level in the organization, and you repeat. So this whole methodology could be run as like a one-time pulse for the year, but we tend to advocate for more of a longitudinal study where you're constantly collecting more stories. You could also use this as a way of detecting weak signals and setting up automated alerts. So if we have a particularly negative, weak signal from this demographic and this part of the organization, you could create an alert that essentially says, "Hey, we got 5 new negative stories this week. Does the leader want to do anything about it? Does the RTE want to do anything about it?" And so it's a really nice methodology kind of to stay in touch with, what people are experiencing on a week by week basis. It's a way of staying in touch with the Gemba, if you're familiar with that philosophy from lean management. So one of the reasons I think why sense making is a much more powerful and impactful methodology from my perspective is that there are no right and wrong answers to how people respond to the questions, as opposed to a Likert scale where there are kind of you do want to be closer to a 5 than a 0 on most of those questions, and that enables gaming and gifting. Sense making allows you to look broadly across the organization, and then drill down into specific experiences. You obviously have the explanatory power of those narratives, right, to back up the quantitative data. And maybe just one anecdote on this. We were using this methodology at Intel, and we were collecting, thousands of stories. And I was working with one executive. I think he was in charge of about 6,000 engineers or so. And so I produced kind of a report or analysis of the stories coming from his organization. And he was going through the stories, and he read one of them. And his initial reaction was like, ugh, that person doesn't get it. That person doesn't understand why we made that decision. So it was essentially, a member of his staff that was upset with a particular decision that he made or the leadership team made, and they didn't agree with it and they didn't understand. And so he was like, that person clearly doesn't understand. They don't understand these different, customer needs and market conditions that we were responding to. And then after about maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 seconds of venting on how that person didn't understand, he just paused. And he was dead quiet for like 10 seconds. And then he said, maybe we didn't do enough. Maybe we didn't do a good enough job explaining that decision and explaining the rationale behind that decision to our team. Right. And so having that narrative that backs up the quantitative data, these narratives, these lived experiences are really, really difficult to ignore and dismiss, because they essentially represent, your team's lived experience and what they're feeling and thinking. And I think you got this last point. Participants interpret their own stories as opposed to having researchers inject their own bias. So yeah, that's, I guess, a little bit about sense making and why I'm such a fan. I'm gonna pause here and see if you guys have questions, and then I have a kind of a call to action for you. Any questions about this methodology or approach?
How do you guard against retaliation, especially when you're
Yeah.
when you basically have you are tying roles to responses? Like in very large organizations, you can probably dismiss that concern, but the smaller the organization gets, the more likely, especially negative feedback, is tied to an individual.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes there's kind of two thoughts on this one. Sometimes individuals, in my own experience working with this methodology, they want to be known. Like, this is Dan Walsh's story. Let me tell you what happened. And I want to be known. In other cases, that's not the case. They want to be anonymous. So almost every time that I've deployed this method, and we've done, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 of these by now, we've always made it anonymous, but not confidential. So what I mean by that is if you want to be anonymous, you can choose to be anonymous. If you want to add your name to your story, you can add your name to the story. But your story will be read. Your story will be read and will be broadly distributed and will be used in reports. So just make sure that people know that their story will be read. And then all the questions are anonymous and optional. So if you don't want to add your name to a story, you're welcome to use fake names, right? You're welcome to not signify that you are a scrum master or you're a product owner. And you just skip that demographic question if you're afraid of retaliation. So that's how we usually get around that. All right. So the framework that we just walked through with the questions um, was really designed with these research questions in mind. What's the current mood of our organization? Where do we have agency and motivation for change? What are the impediments that we should be looking at to change? And then what are the differences based on the role? So depending on the nature of the research you want to do, you would change the nature of the questions. We wanted to design a very lightweight framework that people could use, back in their own office. And so this is a lightweight framework that's really kind of fit for purpose for doing a retrospective at scale. You could do this retrospective with your art, you could do it with your department. But if you are interested, you could essentially replicate this experiment back with your organization. You don't need, very many fancy tools. I've seen people use Google Docs for this. I've seen people use SurveyMonkey, right, for the sliders, or Qualtrics, or whatever your survey tool of choice is that you currently are enabled to use by, the IT powers that be. Use that survey tool and reconstruct this framework and collect some stories and try and make sense of those stories and shape the patterns of your organization. So I think this is a nice lightweight way of kind of getting introduced to sense making that you can do with pencil and paper, as we did at the Agile 2024, or you could use a tool like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey if you'd like. All right, and I'm happy to take questions. That was a very lightweight introduction to participative narrative inquiry and sense making. I'm happy to go into other places. So, what do you guys want to talk about? What can I help with?
Jeff, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh no, I actually had to bow out of the meeting for about 10 minutes, so I'm gonna have to go back over the video. Hopefully it's up fairly quickly because it looks very useful.
Yeah, for sure. We'll
Very
definitely have
soon, very useful.
the recording on YouTube. So Dan, you mentioned follow up. In other words, you advocate for that. Do you have a specific cadence that you recommend? Quarterly, 6 months, year follow up? Like what's typically the best uh gap of time between one survey and the next? Or not survey, sense
Yeah,
making.
yeah. So I heard two questions there. I heard follow-up, which is kind of like closing the loop on the submissions, and then there's follow-up in terms of where you're going was the cadence. What's the appropriate cadence? And I'm happy to tackle both of those, but was it the latter?
Yeah, it was kind of the latter, but that's really, you raise a good point. I'm also interested in, what follow up on, we identified these action items, like what are those typical time frames look like too?
Yeah. Yeah. I think my preference is to have this as where I can, I advocate for more of a longitudinal approach. And what we mean by that is you're constantly collecting stories over a long period of time. And there's different ways you can do that. We had these storytelling champions where people were submitting a story every day for their departments. You could say everyone on the team needs to submit a story every 2 weeks at the end of a sprint. You could collect another batch of stories every quarter at the end of quarterly planning. Um, and in ad hoc, right? Maybe after a particular, I don't know, root cause analysis or containment excursion event, you would collect stories. So there's all kinds of ways that you can collect stories. I'm an advocate for collecting them real time on an ongoing basis. Um, if that's not always possible because there's like survey fatigue and people don't believe in the methodology yet, usually a lighter weight approach is just to do a one-time pulse, right? We're just going to get a pulse on where the organization is at right now. And then if they like the results of that, maybe the pulse turns into something you do every year, every 6 months, every quarter. Um, but regardless of the nature of longitudinal versus one-time pulse, it is very, 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 very important. That's 5 areas or 6 areas, I don't know. That you take action on these stories quickly. They rot. This information rots. The nature of people's lived experiences changes and evolves. Um, the problems in a complex adaptive system, the problems don't sit still, right? They're constantly changing and evolving. So I would guess, I don't know if I have like a real quantitative number, but this is just kind of based on intuition. I would guess that if you collect 100 stories today in a quarter, a third of those are going to be irrelevant and wasted. 6 months from now, half of those stories will be meaningless. And so then what does that mean? If you wait 6 months to take action on these stories, you just lit them on fire and wasted half the employee's time. Right? So it's really important. And I kid you not, like we were getting this down to real-time alerts where if a negative story from this particular demographic came in this organization and that story was about leadership, we had a real-time alert that got triggered, and I would know within 24 hours that that was a problem, and I could take that story to that leader of that organization and say, hey, you got a really negative, gnarly story that came in. What do you want to do about it? And maybe that's another thing to mention about this is you can do proper like statistical analysis and correlation analysis. You need to be a little bit careful about causation and claims around causation. Um, but when you do get a set of stories come in, really the argument shifts from, is it statistically relevant to something more like, do we have enough evidence to take action? Have we heard enough from our teams that there's a big enough problem for us to get off the couch and do something about it? Right? So you don't necessarily need to rely on a statistical claim, although that's helpful at times. Really what you're saying is this negative story or stories meaningful enough for us to do something about it or not?
Yeah, totally makes sense. Thanks.
Mhm.
Um, Anybody else? Questions, comments?
no questions. This is just really, really interesting and organized in a really interesting way. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I guess
The
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I did have one more question because I'm just not very familiar with Cynefin. Like, how much of a broader tapestry does Cynefin paint outside of sense making and what you've presented today?
Yeah, so Cynefin and the Cynefin Company, it's really, the brainchild of David Snowden. I think it's helpful to think about the Cynefin framework as a situational leadership framework. So depending on the situation, you need to take action in different ways and whatnot. And I think where his work and methodologies, methods and practices really shine is in the complex domain. So this particular methodology is fit for purpose, designed for working with complex adaptive human systems. And he has a whole portfolio of methods and techniques, like future backwards, anecdote circles, and estuarine mapping and things of that nature. But really, his practice and his work and the methods of the Cynefin Company are really designed around how do you take effective action when you have a complex problem. So hopefully that positions Cynefin as a sense-making framework to understand the nature of your situation and to adapt your leadership style, combined with a portfolio of methods and techniques and different tools like sense-making that are fit for purpose, built for complex problems.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think definitely need to educate myself on that wider world. Um, cool. All right. Anybody else have questions?
And most of what we talked about here today is in the context of, I don't know, I would say culture change and lean and agile adoption. But this methodology is appropriate for lots and lots of different complex human problems. So we've used this for employee retention and engagement. We've used this for user requirements capture and picking up on unarticulated needs of users. Um, uh, I personally haven't, but the Cynefin Company has used this widely in NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to make sense of labor unions and impoverished, struggling youth in different geographies, or how some refugees are suffering or thriving, or how impoverished villages and India are adopting, more sanitary, plumbing and things like that. So, yeah, I guess there's a whole, very as rich as the human experience, this technique can really help with almost any complex problem that your organization is struggling with at the moment.
Will you be leaving this mural board up for a while?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's like one of those things, like I don't plan to delete the mural account, but I don't know, in 5 years, maybe it'll be gone.
It gradually disappears, probably.
It'll gradually disappear. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if the web archive can archive it, but maybe we should just do that. Okay, any other questions?
I'm trying to remember Snowden's site, because it was one thing and then it changed, and I can't remember where it's at now.
I would just his site where his methods are, or his company. If you just look at Cynefin Company, I'm sure it'll come up.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And the site where his methods are posted is cynefin.io. It's like his open source wiki. Do you get, I don't know, like maybe take it with a leap of faith, but assuming that you buy into this approach and methodology, what reservations do you have about starting it at your company?
Mine would only be team size, because I work at maybe not. We have many presenters come in who are talking about companies, in the tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
And so I think just the smaller company and also the survey culture that already exists. In other words, we survey to death
Yeah.
in cases across many different spectrums. Like I have 2 or 3 surveys on my plate I still haven't filled out. So I think that would
Mhm.
probably be my concern, is that it would just be perceived as another one of those. And then on smaller teams, how effective it could be. But at the same time, this really has opened my eyes up to, uh,
Yeah.
a different philosophy that I think we could potentially try and use.
I
Yeah.
would imagine I'm usually looking broader as a coach at the organization as well, and being able to see team level responses and then also perhaps contrast with more leader level responses because often enough there's a gap.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very true. You'll have, I don't know, typically I tend to see the leader stories and coming from mid-level management and senior leaders to be more positive. Um, if you did a paired comparison for those populations of leaders and senior managers versus frontline troops, there tends to be a statistical difference between those two populations in terms of like the positive nature of the questions.
Right.
Um, that's definitely one pattern. You don't get as many questions or as many responses from leaders as well. They'll tend to do one or two, and that's why it's important to make this kind of like an ongoing thing and more of a longitudinal study. And then maybe that goes back to your question, Ben. If you're working with a smaller team, I think you do need to have about, I don't know, I would say ideally 40 to 50 stories before you start to see any kind of a pattern. And even if it is a very weak pattern, there's still probably something that you can do to get more stories that are positive and fewer stories that are negative. So to get, I don't know, if you have an 8-person team and you need 40 stories, well, you need to have, 5 stories a person. And so these again are just like little anecdotes of what happened this week, what happened next week, et cetera. And you can start to build up that, I guess, portfolio of stories. And then once you have some sort of critical mass, you could do one of these, workshops to make sense of the larger patterns. That's kind of the approach I would take with a smaller team. And then of course, if you only have an 8-person team, everyone kind of knows who wrote the stories. Like the anonymity really goes out the window just based on people's tone and the words they use and how well they know each other. So,
Well, and I think it might make sense, especially at the granular team level, to maybe run a retro or two just to get people used to the idea and look at it. I don't know if it's going to give enough signal, but I do like the sliding scale and the story itself as well, and focusing and concentrating on that, because I've been a part of so many retros that just get a glom of many different ideas, and it's good and helpful to vote some of those up to the top, but it's usually just a sentence or two. So I like the
mhm.
concept of a story plus the sliding scales that you showed.
Yeah, and maybe that's another cautionary tale as well. Um, the way you frame these prompts is important. What you're looking for is an experience, a story, an anecdote that gives you hope or concern for the future of Agile. Um, what this is not, this should not be like a list of bullets or a set of comments. Like if someone were to write, I have concern about the future of Agile, and if the story is we don't have enough transparency, like stop, like you're doing it wrong. That's not what we're asking for. Give me an example of where we didn't have enough transparency, and then click the box about transparency. Right? You're looking for that anecdote, that story, that experience, not a list of bullets, not a list of bullets or comments.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Okay, yeah, we just have a few minutes left. Any other comments or thoughts from folks before we wrap up? Or question? Okay. Well, Dan, again, thank you. This has been very helpful, very eye-opening for me. Like I said, we'll post the recording to our YouTube channel pretty soon, hopefully by early next week, and we'll get it out there and publicized as well. So, any final words or plugs, Dan?
I usually don't like doing plugs, but you guys know where to find me. Dan Five Wise. And I'm happy to share, I don't know, more of my experiences. If you do want to give this a shot at your company, I'm happy to give you some tips and tricks. So good luck.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Dan, again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Everybody have a good weekend, and we'll see you next month.
All right, take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.